thank you, Professor Mahbubani. I really do appreciate you having me today. It's an honor for me to be able to speak to all these young, bright minds. I'm sure that I'll learn more than you'll ever learn from me, but it's terrific to be at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. It's especially special for me because a gentleman that I admired so much and I've learned so much from, is mentor Minister Lee Kuan Yew. He's given me lots of tutelage on Asia and China and India and has tremendous insights. So if I could do anything to return that favor, pay a little bit of tuition, I guess is that the term we would use here, I'll do that in the form of a speech. It's probably about all I could afford anyway. I thought I would go back, and the statistics that Kishore was raising are actually quite interesting because it sort of reminds me of the founder's son of IBM was Tom Watson Jr. In 1962, he gave a speech at a lectern at another famous university in the United States, and he was asked to talk about what it meant to be a steward of a company that was 50 years old at that point in time. And what were your thoughts about the corporate life, and what has the company learned that other leaders might learn from that experience? The statistics then were also very interesting. They correlate. He began by saying of the 25 industrial corporations in the United States in the year 1900, only 2 remained in 1961. One of those because they bought 6 others, and the others either disappeared or had fallen down on the list. So that was that 50 years. And then he said, which is I think a stark comment by the way, figures like these help remind us that corporations are expendable and that success at best is an achievement which can always slip out of one's hands. Well, here we are 50 years later, and IBM is celebrating its centennial. So what have 100 years of history taught us? Well, one thing it's taught us that Tom was right. Success is fleeting. And of the top 25 companies on the Fortune 500 at the time of Watson's lecture, only 4 remain in 2010, and one is IBM. So you can see everyone else is sort of gone by the wayside. More importantly, though, our history has taught us something about the source of any business or institution's continued success and impact, and that's what I really would like to spend some time on with you today. People that are familiar with our history are often struck not merely by our longevity, but with the fact that we have continually changed. We started off, you might find this interesting, making clocks, scales, cheese slicers, and punch card tabulators. Advanced technology at its time. Computation, I guess, was the width of the cheese that we were calculating. But since then, it's been kind of a blur if you think about IBM. Typewriters, vacuum tube calculators, magnetic tape, the first disk drive, the first memory chip, Fortran, fractals, ATMs, mainframes, mini computers, personal computers, supercomputers, services, advanced software, and analytics. All of this has evolved over a time where we started operating in one country, till today where we operate in 170 countries and have just begun our initiatives to truly globally integrate the IBM company. So you might say, wow, you haven't done the same thing for 100 years. And that's probably one way to look at our history. Another view is that we've been doing the exactly same thing for a century. And that's what I would like to offer to you as our first lesson for today's lecture. And again, I'd like to quote Tom Watson Jr. in 1962. Again, 1962. I firmly believe that any organization, in order to survive and achieve success, must have a sound set of beliefs on which it premises all of its policies and actions. Next, I believe the most important single factor in corporate success is faithful adherence to those beliefs. And finally, I believe that if an organization is to meet the challenges of a changing world, it must be prepared to change everything about itself except those beliefs as it moves through corporate life. And I'd like to repeat the closing sentence. Change everything about itself except those beliefs. Now, Tom Watson wasn't talking about ethical precepts. There wasn't a banking crisis and all those things that have occurred of late. For him, a company's beliefs were its identity, what made it distinct, what shapes its decisions and behaviors. If you could codify that and sustain that core, it would ensure that a company could remain unique and differentiated decade after decade, regardless of the geographic source of its competitors. Well, in IBM's case, the need for continual forward movement is part of our business model. IBM, our value proposition is to create and to provide innovative solutions for our clients, solutions that they can't get from anyone else, solutions that require us to invest $6 billion a year every year in research and development that just aren't commonly available in the marketplace. And that compels us not to sit still. It's a constant reminder never to define yourself by the things you make, no matter how successful you are with those today, even if you had the best cheese slicer in the world. Time has taught us how essential this balance is between what changes and what endures, how it can go awry, and how we have to continually revisit this for generation upon generation. In fact, I would argue that the need for a foundation of belief and values is greater today than ever before, because change is faster today than ever before, and that the arena is larger and more complex than ever before in this globalizing world. And work spread across vast networks of organizations and individuals, people need something that holds them together, that provides a touchstone for their actions and their decisions. A decade ago when I came into this job, and I guess if most CEOs these days of American companies don't make it much more than 4 years, as the good professor knows. I'm going into my 9th. So at least I'm running 100% better than average, as my children point out to me constantly, you know, especially the business school kid. He's very quick to point out the statistics. But, you know, we sat back and we realized that there were going to be major shifts in our industry. I mean, tectonic plate shifts that would test the mettle of every company in the tech industry. Now, going back 10 years ago, so as I say these things, you have to take yourself back to about 2001, 2002, and the dot-com bubble had just burst. There was going to be a new computing model that would sweep away the PC-centric one. Globalization would reorder economies and markets, and our clients would have a different expectation of technology, not just a tool for productivity, but as a tool for transformation. A small circle of us at IBM knew that this was going to happen, and we wanted to seize upon these shifts and take advantage of those. But we also knew that this was going to require another massive transformation of IBM. And you might recall that we just finished the financial turnaround of IBM of the 1990s. We had fixed the company financially, but obviously we had a lot more to do if we were going to go to the future. And quite honestly, I and many of the senior colleagues of IBM really wondered if we could do this again after giving what we had been through over the past several years and the strenuous change it caused in the workforce in our operations. But we decided nearly a decade ago that the only way we were going to be able to do this is to touch the DNA of the company. So one of the first things I did as CEO wasn't very profound, I admit, it wasn't very strategic. Will never be taught in the business school, a school of this prestige, certainly, but that was to re-examine our core values. The question was re-examination of the values. It was really how. How do you do this in the year 2000, 2001, and 2? We no longer live in a world where the chairman or the founder could write down a business and its beliefs, Tom Watson Sr., a 103-page book that formed the cultural fabric of IBM. As I said to my colleagues, the employees are just super smart, highly independent, and even cynical, and you can't come down from high with these big ideas and call them their values, because they'll be viewed as your values, not their values. So we took a different approach. We came together online. Global population came together for 72 hours in what we called a jam. I guess today you'd call that social media. It was messy, passionate, contentious, And in the end, IBMers embraced this new set of values because they themselves shape the beliefs of the company. I truly believe, and I mean this in all sincerity, of all the things we've done in IBM and that I've been involved in, remaking our portfolio, changing our products and services, globally integrating the company, expanding operations all throughout Asia, launching Smarter Planet in the depth of a global recession. Go back after Lehman had just collapsed, we launched Smarter Planet, talked about the effectiveness of sustainability and going back to basics, back to our roots, back to our foundation, back to our culture. I'd like to give you an example of why I've spent so much time on this and why I think it's real. We introduced at IBM the PC in 1981, and then the very popular ThinkPad in 1992. It was, by any measure, the most recognizable brand for us, and arguably the only brand we had that touched individuals, tens of millions of people. For the most part, IBM is B2B, as you would say in today's parlance. For all those reasons, the idea that we would divest the PC business, for many, and pardon the pun, was unthinkable. But yet, we knew the emerging computing model would only accelerate the commoditization of the PC industry, and that's not where we wanted to be. Part of continually moving to the future is moving to where value will be the greatest and profits the highest. As Watson said, where you can be distinguished and differentiated. It's why IBMers shaped the value that reads, innovation that matters for our company and for the world. Their value, not management's value. So we decided our PC business was better served in the hands of another company. And it turned out to be Lenovo, a Chinese company. The point and the decision, which would have caused rift inside the company, remember, these are the people who had the patents and invented the IBM PC, as well as the hard drive, and we also divested of that, was not merely about economics and strategy, but it was easy because it was consistent with our values, and there was very little resistance to the change that was necessary to divest of the business. Not easy operationally to pull it out of the supply chain and everything else, but not hard culturally. I mean, we were innovators. Remember, in 1991, the PC was an innovation, but that was 20 years ago. And it lost much of its differentiation, and it was time to move on. It was time to go to the future. Of course, every great company holds unique beliefs, so I'm not saying we're unique in that regard. But translating those beliefs into action, that is what separates, I think, the good companies from the great companies, and that's what I think belief should be all about. And that translation does not happen in strategies or in process. It happens in culture. And in light of this, IBM's history can be seen as a century-long journey to create and continually recreate a culture. Indeed, this was arguably Tom Watson Sr.'s most enduring contribution to the business world. The notion that an organization can and must undertake the intentional creation of a culture based on a set of beliefs and values. Now, we have spent 100 years seeking to remain faithful to what makes us, us. Even when technology shifts, even when global economies move to fundamentally different bases or different places, through multiple generations of products, markets, and people, we have stayed true to what makes us, us. For most companies, their culture is an extension of the organizational founder, his or her beliefs, actions, decisions, personality, which is why we see such interest in charismatic superstar leaders. Without question, the cult of personality. It's business lore. Media loves it. They write about it. The market trades on it. It's incredible. Superstar celebrity CEOs. And I would argue that Tom Watson Sr. in his time was one of those, with the Carnegies and the Rockefellers and the Watsons. And many just like him in the Tatas, if I come to this part of the world, and the Mitsubishis and the Toyotas and the others from around the world. He was one of those. But what happens when the founder is no longer around? The challenge becomes, how do you perpetuate this culture over time? That's hard. Over a century, that's really hard. So it's about how you bottle up what makes an organization distinctive. What makes Walmart, Walmart? What makes Apple, Apple? For that matter, what makes Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy? Why you all are here? What makes you unique? As Tom Watson said in 1962, we need to do this to our own organizations, whether in business, government, academia, or anywhere. Or in other words, if we don't do this, we will not be able to meet the challenges of a future world. So let me offer two thoughts on two challenges of our future world. One is going to be technology, and the other is going to be what the professor talked about, the rebalancing of the global economies. First, the future of technology and its implications for today's leaders. Over the course of the last century, information technology has gone from a set of tools to an industry, to a science, to a pervasive aspect of the modern world. It has therefore become something that every leader must master, and I don't mean learning how to tweet or use an iPad. IT today isn't just a back office engine or a never-ending flow of consumer gadgets. Technology is the way we now see the world, including those dimensions invisible to the human eye. It's how we map and understand the dynamics of the world's complex systems, and it's increasingly how we decide on the best course of action and what we need to put into effect. Indeed, this technology now pervades every aspect of the world and how it works. Its systems, its processes that enable services to be delivered, physical goods to be developed, manufactured, and sold, everything from people and freight, oil, water, electrons to move, and billions of people around the world and how they work and live. Today, there are nearly 1 billion transistors, yes, 1 billion transistors per human, and each one costs 1/10,000,000th of a cent. There are 4 billion mobile phone subscribers, 30 billion RFID tags produced globally. These sensors and devices give us, for the first time, real-time instrumentation, data, tons of data. And they hit all systems, natural and man-made. The planet really isn't just being instrumented, at the same time it's being interconnected. Today there are 2 billion people on the internet, but the systems and objects can now speak to one another too. This is what some call the Internet of Things. But think about a prospect of 1 trillion connected instrumented objects, cars, cameras, roadways, pipelines, livestock, and pharmaceuticals. All of this is creating vast amounts of data, and through advanced analytics that are ever more powerful and using supercomputers and equivalent technology, all of that data we call big data can be turned into big insight. All over the world, we see forward-thinking leaders who are mastering these new capabilities. They're applying the intelligence to make systems, processes, and infrastructures more efficient, productive, and responsive. Police Commissioner Ray Kelly in New York in the Crime Center. New York is now one of the safest large cities in the world. And Stockholm Transit Head Gunnar Soderholm is deploying smarter traffic solutions in Sweden's capital to reduce congestion and pollution and obviously improve productivity and quality of life. You miss this if you see technology merely as a succession of gadgets, websites, and next big things. It is much more than that. Please look beyond the surface, as I tell my grad student children. It's how the world works. And therefore, today's leaders, those who want to keep moving to the future, have an obligation to understand not its mechanics or its wiring diagrams or its circuitry or its software, but its implications, and to incorporate that into how they build their organizations, and not just their business process or their management systems, but their culture. Now, the next trend I want to highlight is the future of global integration. I mean, I think it's well understood that the world globally is rebalancing itself. That's well underway. There's nothing surprising to you all here, especially in this part of the world. It's also an understanding that the globe is integrating and will continue to create new economic opportunities, most importantly through hundreds of millions of people around the world entering the middle class. They are becoming consumers, entrepreneurs, and this is a macroeconomic fact of historic proportions. But implications for leaders of organizations go beyond looking to the emerging markets or these markets for growth or productivity gains. The shift is also changing how we work, and it will force us once again to reset our worldview and how organizations see their role in the world. Because we believe that this shift was inevitable, we transformed IBM over the past decade. We changed the 20th century multinational model where companies created mini versions of themselves in country after country in order to operate in crazy quote of international trade regulations and barriers. Instead, we are moving to something new. It's far more systemic in what we call the globally integrated enterprise. It's not only changing the market opportunities we pursue, it's also changing how we work and run the company, from sales, marketing, to HR, and research, and yes, even finance. For example, we've significantly lowered our operational center of gravity. And again, I'm not talking about the 1980s horizontal management style structures and reporting lines and reducing layers of management. It's about where you locate expertise and decision-making, not concentrated in the corporate headquarters, but globally networked. And it's also about where you integrate your company. And for us, that's not in Armonk, New York, where I reside. It's a center of client interaction. It's wherever that happens to be in the world. That is the integrating point of the IBM company. We've also changed our understanding of skills, relationships, and responsibilities that IBMers must assume to make this globally integrated model work. And let me give you one example that encompasses all these shifts in our leadership development model. I, and like many of my colleagues in IBM, did an overseas assignment. And as we heard, I worked in Japan, mostly in IBM Japan, but a little bit supporting our Asian operations. That was typically 2 or 3 years, and young high flyers were sent off to do those sorts of things. Most everybody that works for me has done one of these assignments, and some two, around the world, some one place or another. But that was expensive, it was limited, it was a handful of people, it took much more time than you really have in today's world. So in a world where growth is increasingly coming from your world, people call the emerging markets, we kind of view as just other countries that we operate in. Many of these places we've been for 80 years. It's hard to call it emerging for the IBM company. We've been in and out of some of these countries longer than tech companies have existed. But I guess we'll use the common definition of emerging market. But IBM is globally engaging in this is far wider and closer to the ground than in the past. And so our model for development of people just wasn't going to work. So we decided we needed to do something called Create Global Citizens. And and do something that would scale, not like sending people off on a foreign assignment. So 3 years ago, we launched an experiment we called the Corporate Citizens Corps, which is not modeled on forms of executive training. Well, you might find this interesting. It's modeled on the Peace Corps. It puts together diverse teams of high-potential IBMers from all around the world. It sends them for a month or two in communities and cities in emerging markets such as Ghana, Philippines, Turkey, Tanzania, Vietnam. And they work in communities with NGOs and local leaders to jumpstart their economies, to make their cities smarter. And then they come back and they spread what they've learned to their colleagues through, yes, social media, or jams, the old-fashioned way. The results have been highly encouraging. Not only can we provide this experience for more IBMers, thousands, because we can scale it versus dozens, but these targeted interventions are having a transformational impact, both on local communities and on IBMers themselves. Most say it's the most meaningful experience they've had in their lives being on one of these assignments. Thousands have volunteered. We have more volunteers than we have projects that we can assign them to. And oh, by the way, it also helps us gather invaluable learning about the reality of on the ground in these emerging countries. And it strengthens our societal relationships, and it's surfacing profitable new business opportunities as well. So, of course, the world's going global, and it's been going global for centuries. We've heard that earlier. But it's going to be different in the 21st century than it was in the 19th and the 20th century. And to be a leader in the future, I think, will mean thinking globally, not geographically. So put all this together, and what does IBM's history teach us? Well, I would suggest it's a lesson in long-term thinking and managing for the long term. Of course, everyone pays this lip service, don't they? Everyone takes it seriously. Long-term thinking is a management approach, but it produces identifiable results. It's not an election cycle. It's not a quarterly earnings release. It truly is long-term. It determines how you allocate and invest resources. It takes a kind of institutional patience to invest in R&D. The payoff, if it ever comes, takes years. It shapes your view of talent development. To develop talent that can lead the enterprise generation after generation takes money, time, and patience. And I'm not just talking about the top management. It's about developing leaders top to bottom in the organization throughout the world, not the top 20 or 30 or 40 or 300. It's thousands of people around the world that you need to develop. I mean, from its inception, IBM has been an advocate of social progress. And I think back in time, we've always pushed for progressive workplace policies. And we hired our first disabled employee in 1914. We established equal pay for equal work for women in the 1930s. We put our equal opportunity policy in place in 1954, 11 years before the U.S. Civil Rights Act. In 2005, we became the first company to put genetic information off limits in employment-related decisions. So finally, managing for the long term tells us something about how and when you take decisive action. It's not a mindset of the slow and steady or being risk-adverse. On the contrary, building for the long term is not for the faint-hearted. It often compels the enterprise to act when it isn't obvious, to place bets that seem risky in the near term, but also allows you to deal with corporate inertia and address issues even in good times. So the constant in all this is what the enterprise values and what it believes, which I think starts with the leaders of the enterprise, and in a U.S. public company that tends to be the CEO. For me, I come to work every day with the mindset that IBM will outlive me, and with a determination that I and my colleagues will pass on to future generations of IBM and to the world a better IBM, and a better IBM that they will inherit as they go to the future. In fact, one thing that leading a company like IBM teaches you is not to see yourself as a captain of industry, but as a temporary steward of a great enterprise. I'm the 8th of 8 CEOs in 100 years. The measure of any entity, any business, government, university, or any other institution is ultimately what is its impact, how is the world different because it existed. I admit to you that I have a bias, as you might expect, and I hope you agree, but I believe that the world is better because the IBM Corporation existed. And I think if you look out in 50 years and go to 2061, or 100 years and go to 2111, you'll still see IBM at the top of the Fortune 500, creating great value for its employees, its shareholders, and its clients. So, what is this? I think it's a lesson in the hard work of progress. And goodness knows we need some of that today. So thank you for your time. Thank you for listening. And now I'll take your questions.